Hello, I am Professor Mindnoodle. I wanted to talk to you about how the different parts of your brain function, and how they respond to trauma and chronic stress. Let's first name all the parts we will be discussing. First we have the amygdala, the first member of Team Brain. Next member of Team Brain is the prefrontal cortex. Next is the hypothalamus. Next is the hippocampus. We also have the insular cortex, or insula. Here is the anterior cingulate cortex, or ACC. Together, they form Team Brain. One of their primary functions is to protect you from trauma and chronic stress. Trauma, or chronic stress, is a vicious villain who tries to take over each member of Team Brain, and is Team Brain's archenemy. The longer each member of Team Brain has to endure trauma and chronic stress, the more destruction trauma is able to cause. Trauma increases in power when someone you trust hurts your feelings, hits you, or uses bad touch. First, we have the amygdala. It is one of two almond-shaped groups of nuclei, located deep, medially, and on each side of the brain. The amygdala is one of the only structures that is formed by the time the child is born. The amygdala sends widespread projections to subcortical and cortical areas, such as basal forebrain, striatum, nucleus accumbens, hippocampus, and sensory cortices. It is far-reaching and critical to the developing brain. The amygdala has been coined the threat detector. It is responsible for the development and primary regulation of the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system in infancy. Sympathetic nervous system activates what is often termed as the fight or flight response that occurs when the body is under stress. The parasympathetic system activates stimulation of rest and digest, or feed and breed responses that occur when the body is at rest.
When the amygdala, undergoes stress, the results can cause me to become larger and may cause me to experience fear and depression differently. It will also increase my cortisol levels, and reduce my neuron potential.
The increase in size, that the amygdala is linked to a higher depression and anxiety risk in children and adults. The increase in cortisol levels is one of the strongest predictors of major depressive disorder, and generalized anxiety disorder in adults. When the neuron potential is reduced, mild apprehensive-producing aspects of the environment are perceived to be dangers, interactions are limited, and anxiety may arise. Also noted was the correlation between reduced levels of neuron potential and lower IQ levels, difficulties with memory, and difficulties with developing healthy boundaries. Next is the insular cortex. The insular cortex, or insula, is located in the brain region that lies in a deep recess between the temporal and frontal lobes. To see the insula on an intact brain, you would have to go into the lateral fissure and separate the temporal and the frontal lobes from each other, and the insula would be exposed. Insula is where our emotional effort occurs. Efforts include disguising emotions and addressing conflicting emotions. Insula also regulates your social emotions.
When trauma induces stress on me, the insula, I can no longer disguise my emotions or control my behaviors.
The insula registers disbelief and generates emotional disgust.
When I am under stress, unclean surroundings do not bother me. I am unable to perform simple tasks like maintaining personal hygiene, such as bathing or brushing my teeth.
Insula plays a role in taste, that includes flavor aversion learning, which connects a particular taste or flavor of food to food poisoning.
When the stress of food poisoning occurs, the aversion to the food or the place the food was prepared can last for several years.
Insula causes feelings in the body such as hunger.
When I am under stress, internal feelings and feeding states can lead to exaggerated or restricted eating behaviors.
The insula provides the sense of agency, or sense of control. It is the subjective awareness of initiating, executing, and controlling one's own volitional actions in the world. It is the pre-reflective awareness or implicit sense that it is I who is executing bodily movements or thinking thoughts. In normal, non-pathological experience, the sense of agency is tightly integrated with one's sense of ownership, which is the pre-reflective awareness or implicit sense that one is the owner of an action, movement or thought.
When I am under stress or have experienced trauma, it is difficult for me to understand how others feel or take ownership of my bad behaviors.
Insula manages sympathetic responses, which includes fight or flight reactions, versus parasympathetic nervous system responses, which includes rest and digest reactions.
When I am under trauma or chronic stress, I often freeze or become very rowdy.
Insula may be responsible for humans experiencing the feeling of a self, and having a sense of boundary of that self, allowing for a distinction between me and you.
When I am under stress, it may be difficult for me to understand my own identity and navigate appropriate boundaries.
Next is the prefrontal cortex. It is located at the front of the brain, at the front of each cerebral hemisphere. The prefrontal cortex sits directly behind the forehead. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for empathy, our conscious awareness and sensitivity to the mind of someone else. It helps our ability to consider another person's feelings. Another feature of the prefrontal cortex is to provide emotional balance. It helps keep emotional responses in check, and prevents them from overwhelming our human brain with a purely emotional response. Anytime we feel sadness, anger, fear, it is the prefrontal cortex that allows modification of those feelings to functional behavior. So, as a part of that function, it provides affect regulation. In addition to the affect management, the prefrontal cortex provides response flexibility, which is the ability to pause before acting. Without this ability, it would be our human tendency to act on the first impulse for behavior that we receive. This is the part of the brain that allows us to have insight. It does that by integrating memory stores that provide emotional context to our current life events. In addition to insight, the prefrontal cortex allows us to develop and utilize intuition. The ability to trust your gut should be a building block of good decision-making skills. When making decisions, the ability to consider impact not only to self, but to the larger social good is vital. This is morality, and development of it occurs in the prefrontal cortex.
Under chronic stress, physiologically, two actions are occurring. The neurons develop debranching and shrinkage of dendrites, while other neurons expand dendrites. Under stress, my ability to regulate decision-making and making rational decisions is diminished. When under stress, higher levels of cortisol impair me by interfering with working memory. After experiencing trauma and chronic stress, my ability to self-regulate emotions, balance instinctual responses and emotional responses, or react appropriately to stressful stimuli starts to deteriorate.
Neurons that develop debranching in the prefrontal cortex may be associated with cognitive rigidity, deregulation of decision-making, and a diminished ability to make rational decisions, can cause a spectrum of behavioral problems. High levels of cortisol in the prefrontal cortex may cause impairment in the retrieval of key information in the moment of stress. When the prefrontal cortex becomes impaired due to extended period of stress, or exposure to traumatic events, a person may become hypersensitive to stress, overreact to stimuli, and lose the ability to self-soothe. Next is the hippocampus. The hippocampus is a layered structure located on the floor of the lateral ventricles. It is located below the cerebral cortex. The hippocampus is found in the brain's temporal lobes and acts as a memory indexer by sending memories out to the appropriate part of the cerebral hemisphere for long-term storage and retrieving them when necessary. The hippocampus is the part of the brain that is involved in forming, organizing, and storing memories. It is a limbic system structure that is particularly important in forming new memories and connecting emotions and senses, such as smell and sound, to memories. The hippocampus is a horseshoe-shaped structure, with an arching band of nerve fibers or fornix connecting the hippocampal structures in the left and right brain hemispheres. The hippocampus is important for converting short-term memories into long-term memories. This function is necessary for learning, which relies on memory retention and proper consolidation of new memories. The hippocampus plays a role in spatial memory as well, which involves taking in information about one's surroundings and remembering locations. This ability is necessary in order to navigate one's environment. The hippocampus also works in concert with the amygdala to consolidate our emotions and long-term memories. This process is critical for evaluating information in order to respond appropriately to situations. The hippocampus receives input regarding perceptual information, such as who and what, and binds it to contextual information such as when and where. And the prefrontal cortex facilitates future recollection of and attributions about that information. The prefrontal cortex also modulates amygdala activity via inhibitory mechanisms and communicates with the hippocampus to promote the consolidation of emotional and perceptual information.
When I am under stress, glucocorticoids are released. Prolonged exposure to glucocorticoids kill hippocampal cells and decrease volume within me. I play a significant role in the capacity to recall specific life events. Context-dependent memory. Lesions to me abolish context-dependent form of memory, due to the high density of glucocorticoid receptors in me. It supports the idea that I play an important role in emotion regulation.
When the hippocampus experiences prolonged exposure to glucocorticoids, the normal context regulatory role of the hippocampus is impaired and can cause extreme emotional behavior in inappropriate contexts, difficulty learning, or memory. Other problems occur that include poor memory function, problems with spatial memory, problem with learning, high risk of panic and generalized anxiety disorders, and difficulty inhibiting inappropriate behaviors. There is also the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is located on the undersurface of the brain, or middle of the base of the brain. The hypothalamus encapsulates the ventral portion of the third ventricle, and is part of the limbic system. It lies just below the thalamus, and above the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus is responsible for the production of many of the body's essential hormones. Hormones are a chemical substance that help control different cells and organs. These hormones manage functions such as temperature regulation, thirst, hunger, sleep, mood, sex drive, and the release of other hormones within the body. The hypothalamus houses the pituitary gland and other glands in the body. Small in size, it is involved in many necessary processes of the body, including behavioral, autonomic functions, and endocrine functions, such as metabolism and growth and development. The hypothalamus's primary function is homeostasis, which is to maintain the body's status quo system-wide. Hypothalamic hormones include thyrotropin-releasing, gonadotropin-releasing, growth hormone-releasing, corticotropin-releasing, somatostatin, and dopamine hormones. These hormones release into the blood via the capillaries or small vessels and travel to the pituitary gland. Oxytocin and vasopressin are also hypothalamic hormones. The hypothalamus uses a set point to regulate the body's systems, including electrolyte and fluid balance, body temperature, blood pressure, and body weight. It receives inputs from the body, then makes the proper changes if anything differentiates from this set point. The set point can temporarily change, but remains remarkably fixed from day to day.
When I experience chronic stress or trauma, I start an alarm phase by turning on the autonomic nervous system. Then the cardiac circulation increases, bronchioles dilate, and glycogen released from the liver. The sympathetic nervous system is activated, causing a fight or flight response. The glands start secreting adrenaline and noradrenaline, adrenocorticotropic hormones and glucocorticoids. Finally, the cortisol levels increase throughout the brain.
When the hypothalamus experiences chronic stress or trauma, the hypothalamus cannot tell threats that are real or perceived, thus always keeping the person in a hyperarousal state. The hyperarousal state causes impairments in cardiovascular functions that include hypertension. Lastly, is the anterior cingulate cortex. The anterior cingulate cortex, or ACC, is the frontal part of the cingulate cortex that bears a resemblance to a collar wrapped around the frontal part of the corpus callosum. The dorsal part of the ACC is connected with the frontal cortex and the parietal cortex, as well as the motor system in the frontal eye fields, making it an important location for processing top-down and bottom-up stimuli and assigning appropriate control to other areas in the brain. The ventral part of the ACC is connected with the amygdala, nucleus accumbens, hypothalamus, and anterior insula, or ACC, and is involved in assessing the significance of emotional and motivational information. The anterior cingulate cortex can be separated anatomically and by cognitive and emotional components. It appears to play a role in a wide variety of autonomic functions, such as regulating blood pressure and heart rate. It is also involved in rational cognitive functions such as reward anticipation, decision-making, empathy, impulse control and emotion. The ACC seems to be specifically involved when effort is needed to carry out tasks such as early learning and problem solving. On the cellular level, the ACC is unique in its abundance of specialized neurons called spindle cells. These cells are a relatively recent occurrence in the evolutionary terms and contribute to this brain's region's emphasis on addressing difficult problems as well as the pathologies related to the ACC.
When I am under recurrent stress, or experience trauma, my rational cognitive functions become impaired along with my decision-making abilities. My ability to experience empathy, impulse control and emotions also become impaired.
When the anterior cingulate cortex experiences impairments in rational cognitive functioning and decision-making abilities, a person makes irrational decisions that appear to be self-destructive due to deficiencies in error detection. When a person struggles with empathy, poor impulse control and emotional processing, they are labeled with cluster B personality disorder, or a given diagnosis consistent with oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, or attention deficit hyperactive disorder. Under adverse neurobiological conditions, such as those shaped by frequent or enduring trauma, the individual and connected functions of the hippocampus, prefrontal cortex, hypothalamus, insular cortex, anterior cingulate cortex, and amygdala, can be impacted in ways that not only facilitate inappropriate associations among perceptual, contextual, and attributional information about chronic stress and traumatic events, but also diminish capacity for consciously managing recollections of the events and moderating fear responses to the recollections. Importantly, the pathways from chronic stress and trauma exposure during childhood to these differences in brain region structure, function, and connectivity are potentially many, and chief among them is the pathway through the stress response system. These stress responses can become debilitating to the person experiencing the events, and frustrating to the loved ones around them. Through patient understanding and healthy attachments, Team Brain can, and will be able to defeat chronic stress and trauma. There is hope in the fact that it only takes one healthy attachment to another person for Team Brain to win the battle.
Go Team Brain!